All right, let's keep going. So, is your friend right? Certainly, what he's saying applies to the other 9 men. Even though they might each represent themselves as the only reliable expert, touting their credentials as aeronautics authorities, any decision to follow one of the 9 as opposed to any of the other 9 will ultimately rest on your own understanding of the manual. But you notice in the case of the 10th man, there is a difference. If the rumor is true, then, your decision to trust in him wouldn't have to rest, or to judge him trustworthy wouldn't have to rest on your knowledge of the technical particulars that are described in the manual. It could rest on just your ability to judge whether or not you understand what's in the manual, which is quite a different sort of judgment, one that's arguably within your power, in a way that having to judge technical questions that are very hazy to you is not in your power. If the rumor is true, it would be as if the game show planners decided to let there be a way to safely build the aircraft that didn't depend on the individual contestant's own understanding of the manual. If the rumor is true, you know whom to follow without needing to understand anything from the manual. You share this with your friend, but he replies, "But that's just the problem. You don't know if the rumor is true." So you're back to your own knowledge again, right? You're implicitly, somehow back to your own knowledge of the technical details of the manual, but that's actually not true. So his words deflate you, and you sit down to study the manual in solitude. Then, however, a thought occurs to you. You may not know if the rumor is true, but you do know that the rumor is either true or not true. If the rumor is not true, it would be as if the game show planners seriously expected you to be able to build an aircraft based on your own knowledge of the manual, or to be able to judge accurately which expert is building the aircraft in all the right ways based on your own knowledge of the manual. However, if the rumor is true, then each contestant has a realistic chance of making it to Canada safely, despite not being able to understand the manual or being able to otherwise accurately guess which of the other 9 experts is correct. Now, assume that you know the game show planners would never gamble with your lives in such a reckless way. You can therefore conclude that the rumor is true, that this 10th man in particular is trustworthy, and that building the same type of aircraft as him will guarantee your, and everyone else's, once you convince them, safe flight to Canada. So, to further consider how the above thought experiment is relevant to the papacy, let us consider the difference between what it takes to find the true church on Catholicism and what it would take to find the true church on any version of non-Catholicism. So these slides no longer really reflect my best understanding of how finding the true church works on non-Catholicism, or given the assumption that papal infallibility is not true. As far as I can tell now, if papal infallibility is not true, then your guess as to which church is the true church can only be principled to the extent that you yourself have studied every issue in theology, not just the more limited set of hinge issues. If you were starting on the assumption that one of the existing options has to be right, then if you're starting on the assumption that the true church would have always gotten the answer right to every question, you can basically eliminate Protestantism right off the bat, because they say that there were times when every church basically got some things wrong. And then you would just be deciding among the ancient churches, and you would be deciding based on not every theological issue, but the hinge ones, such as, is the Christology of Chalcedon actually compatible with the Orthodox, small o, Christology of Saint Cyril that all of the ancient churches subscribe to? Because the Oriental Orthodox are going to say, no, it's actually not. That's why Chalcedon has to be rejected. And the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics are going to say, no, actually it is. The filioque question is going to be decisive as between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, if you can know for sure that one of them is right on it and one of them is wrong. Because if we're assuming the true church got everything right, then if Catholicism is wrong about the filioque, then Catholicism is not the true church, etc. So you would be in a good position if you could start with the assumption that basically one church will have always gotten everything right. You would just only have to study the hinge issues. However, I no longer really understand why one is entitled to make the assumption that the true church will have gotten everything right. Is it because, am I supposed to believe that just based on the authority of the ancient churches? I don't know that I can believe anything based on authority if papal infallibility is not true, because any bishop can be wrong, any council can be wrong. I also would feel like I should go back and revisit, just to make sure they were correct, the conclusions of different councils that I had previously taken to be orthodox without really thinking about it. For example, Nicaea, for example, Ephesus, for example, Chalcedon, for example, like First Constantinople, Second Constantinople, Second Nicaea, etc. Because it wouldn't make sense to just assume the primatial authority was reliable up until some point where I suspected he wasn't reliable. I can't trust him on his authority all the way up until some unprincipled point where I no longer am. If I trust him at all, it's only to the extent that his theology happens to agree with what I have independent reason to believe is the truth. And so it's like I really only have a principled reason to trust him insofar as he agrees with me. I should go back and revisit, all of the church councils, because, someone says, well, someone's guaranteed to have gotten everything right. Technically, how do I know that? How do I know that? If they give me a source, I know that church fathers aren't right about everything. And if they source it in the Bible, Matthew 16, I know other interpretations are possible. Just what is it that logically prevents me from entertaining the idea that when Jesus said, on the gates of hell won't prevail against the church, he could have left open the possibility that the gates of hell not prevailing against it looks like eras of partial darkness, punctuated by the light breaking back in, but that also the church would always stand in need of ongoing periodic reform. To me, that's logically coherent. One can entertain that idea. I don't know why I know that it can't be true, in the same way that I know that a square circle can't ever be a real thing. So I can't take the ancient church's understanding of indefectibility / Matthew 16 based on their own authority, nor can I take it on the authority of any church father they may care to bring up. But you might say, well, surely it must be one of the existing options, or it must be that the true church got everything right, because otherwise it would be simply too hard to find out. It would simply be too hard to find out which church is true. Do you think it's easy to even gain the competence to accurately rule on just the hinge issues? Is it easy for the majority of Christendom? Certainly not. Arguably, It's not even that easy for the top intellectuals, because it seems like I can find people who are just arbitrarily smart, arbitrarily educated, arbitrarily knowledgeable. They'll come down on different sides of the filioque question, of the Christology of Chalcedon, although I think it's more common, for people to take the Eastern Orthodox / Catholic view on that. So I'm not sure that it's easy. You can read books and books and books on the filioque and still not know all that there is to know. People's views change on the filioque the more they study it. And sometimes it goes in both directions. Sometimes Catholics end up becoming Eastern Orthodox over it and vice versa. So is that easy? Not really. So, okay, well, but it has to be true because the alternative is too difficult. Well, then the papacy has to be true, because the alternative of having to, everyone become a lay expert on the filioque is too difficult, arguably, based on that kind of assumption or principle. So if you're using that kind of assumption or principle to buttress your understanding of indefectibility, where it must be the case that the true church got every issue right, it would be arbitrary, it would be unprincipled to just follow that sort of consideration only up to a certain point, but not follow it all the way to its true logical conclusion of the papacy. If you rest your case for the thesis that the true church will have gotten everything right, on the assumption that God must have ensured that the true church would get everything right, otherwise it would be too hard for people to discern which church is the true church. There would be too many issues to study, and or those issues are too difficult. That is a very unprincipled move. It's like special pleading. If you get to make that kind of assumption, I would say just go the whole hog and believe in papal infallibility, or at the very least do not consider it an irrational move for someone to just believe in the papacy based on that sort of consideration. So no, really, I don't think you get to make the assumption that the true church is necessarily any of the presently existing options. Could be, for all you know, that every church has fallen into darkness, at least as of right now. So the only way you would really know which theology is the true one is to actually study every single issue exhaustively. At least as one can, because one's guess as to which church is the true church can only be principled to the extent that oneself has studied every theological issue, and one's chances of finding the true church are equal to one's chances of having gotten every single theological issue right independently, which, even within the same church, there's always disagreement on theological issues. Every single person seems to have their own theology. So just, assuming your chances of getting everything right are random, it's like it's 1 out of the total number of Christians or something like that. So yeah, I've talked about these points already. I use the justified true belief account of knowledge. I know that it can be I use this sort of justified true belief definition of knowledge as the working definition for the purposes of these slides. I know that definition can be problematized through Gettier cases, which seem to suggest that the real conditions for knowledge are more stringent. You can't just have justification. What do you need, like super justification or something? Because you can look at a clock that happens to be showing the right time, but is actually broken, and come away with the belief that the current time is 11:10 a.m. and it actually be 11:10 a.m. But your belief that it is 11:10 a.m. is not necessarily actually justified because you looked at a broken clock. So that almost seems to force us to ask more from our definition of knowledge than that it just be justified. Seems to be making the conditions of knowledge more stringent. If one was to quibble with my use of justified true belief for the purpose of these slides, on the grounds that Gettier cases, expose the limits of this kind of definition, I don't know that would actually hurt my argument. I think that would just help it, because as is going to become clear, my argument is going to rest on the difficulty of theology, the difficulty of knowing theology. So if you just make it hard to know theology, that is all to the good as far as the conclusion of this argument is concerned. Having justified true belief in some kind of total theological case is pretty hard. I mean, you can maybe just know like a certain broad principle is true, like sola scriptura. I don't know everything there is to know about theology, but I do know that sola scriptura is true. I think really, in order to have accurate knowledge of whether that is true, that already embraces really a very wide range of facts and considerations, such that if one ever had justified true belief that sola scriptura is true, that would end up requiring quite a bit of study and reflection and like education. But sort of, let's leave that aside. I am conceding that you can sort of have enough knowledge to know that Catholicism is false, and theoretically that would point you in the right direction, because like in a certain sense any church that wasn't the Catholic one would be truer, except of course not necessarily, because what is truer than Catholicism will depend on the sort of considerations of positive theology that led you to rule that Catholicism is false. So it's always a bit more complicated than that. My point being, it really always does kind of come back to your positive conception of theology and how confident you can be in that. I think I've talked about these points. Yep. Keep going. Tended to understand the indefectibility of the true church. Yes. Yeah, I think there's a way that the Protestants actually saw with greater clarity the implications of the primatial leader falling into error, because the ancient churches sort of look back at the practices of the early church and assume, you know what, those were good, we'll keep doing them. Why? Based on authority. Okay. But if councils can be wrong, the primatial leader can be wrong, anyone can be wrong, how can we accept the validity of those practices based on authority? To really have a principled basis for accepting them, we should subject it to our own understanding of how theology works and not just take them on authority. So the Protestants looked at the early church practices and said, if we can't justify this based on our understanding of how theology works, we're going to throw it away. And whether or not they were right to do that, you can debate. But they were right to draw the conclusions that they did regarding whether or not certain ancient practices should be revisited, relitigated. I think they were certainly correct to draw that conclusion. And I think it does illustrate that in the limit, I don't really see any middle ground between Protestantism and Catholicism. That the logical implication of denying papal infallibility is Protestantism, is everyone having to DIY their own theology from the ground up and make sure that they are correct on every single issue, based on their own, say, understanding of Scripture or whatever other sources of authority you consider to be authoritative. And yeah, there's not really a middle ground, because to the extent that you choose to submit to someone's authority while at the same time conceding that any supposed authority can be wrong, if you choose to submit to some authority purely based on their authority while simultaneously conceding that any authority can be wrong on anything, basically, that's unprincipled to the extent that it does not rest on your own actual independent theological study, your ability to do the theological math. And so in that sense, I noticed for some time the commonalities between because see, basically what it was when I became Catholic, it seemed to me that it was easy to make the case for Catholicism as against Protestantism, but it wasn't so easy to make the case for Catholicism as against Eastern Orthodoxy or even Oriental Orthodoxy, or even, for that matter, what do I know, the Assyrian Church of the East. And so, but when I thought about the issue more, I kind of realized that there's a way that Protestants inappropriately treat Scripture as if it were more perspicuous or clear than it really is. But you sort of see why they have to do that, because if they don't do that, then there's no reliable way to find the true church. But I realized that sort of all non-Catholics are sort of in the same boat, as far as they all have to treat theology as if it were more perspicuous or clear than it really is. Because otherwise, you see why, because if it's not, then there's no real reliable way to find the true church. At least not for the average person. And that's why, like I was watching a video with Father Peter Heers, an Orthodox priest, and he was fielding a question from a listener, and the listener was saying, well, I am interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, but I just get so tangled up over whether Eastern Orthodoxy is true or whether Catholicism is true. And Father here seemed to have no empathy for that questioner, because he was like, if you're confused over which one it is, that just shows you don't know the issues at all, because it's an easy call. I'm paraphrasing him, but that's what he was saying. And so there's a certain way where, like I think the so-called ortho-bro apologetics works in a similar way, in the sense that the claim to authority is actually not, if you investigate it, it's not really resting on authority. It is resting on an appeal to you and your own theological capability. It's like they tell you, do the theological math, see for yourself that I'm right. But in a move like that, the operative phrase is see for yourself. Trust me because of my expertise. How will you be able to trust me because of my expertise? Implicitly, because of your expertise in the relevant matters. So in the limit, yeah, I don't know that there's any actual middle ground that we get to say exists between Protestantism and between Catholicism and Protestantism, because if you negate papal infallibility, then your own understanding of theology is what it rests on. And for that to be, for any church affiliation to be principled, you have to believe in that denomination or because it agrees with you, and not because you have some magical knowledge that they are authoritative. All right, keep going. Let me see. I've addressed these. Yep. I think that, I accept one point here that I would just like to make, because I think I worded it decently on this slide. On non-Catholicism, any submission must be 1, intrinsically provisional, and 2, subject to the principle of one's own theological understanding at all times. And hence it can't really be any submission worthy of the term. To the extent that you submit to Eastern Orthodox authority without independently grounding that in your own theological acumen, to that extent your submission is simply arbitrary, unprincipled, random. That is, you don't have actual grounds for excluding alternative choices. And on non-Catholicism, no one is infallible, and any authority or council can err really on any question as far as we know, because everyone acknowledges, well, they're not infallible. I'm not infallible just because of who I am. They're infallible because you can check the math. You can see for yourself that their theology is right. Otherwise, it rests on nothing. The ideal response to this counter objection would be to be able to claim that everyone else, including the Catholic, is just in the same boat. You really only have reason to believe the Pope to the extent that you check all his theological math. But as we have noted, the Catholic is really not in the same boat. Because basically the Catholic may not know that the Pope is right, but the Catholic can know that either the Pope is right or it would have all rested on one's own understanding. So to the extent that the Catholic has reason to doubt that it should have all come down on you, that God would have let it all fall on you, the weight of having to find out what true theology is with respect to every single issue you can think of, really, even the ones that formerly hadn't been up for debate. The Catholic, to the extent that he has grounds to doubt that, he has reason to believe that the Pope is right, regardless of how much theology the Catholic may have under his belt. So it's a very important and relevant difference. I'm not saying most Catholics necessarily use that as the grounds to be Catholic, but I am saying that is a possible justification for one's belief in Catholicism. That is eminently logical, and is more and more logical sort of the more one appreciates the simultaneous difficulty and importance of theology. To really figure out whether papal infallibility is true, we have to ask what the likelihood is that God would have allowed finding the true church reliably to be a matter of true submission to authority. Let's call that proposition A. Versus the likelihood that God would have let the matter rest entirely on one's own ability to independently reproduce, verify, and or reinvent all of theology for oneself. Let's call that proposition not A. And why do I speak in terms of reproducing theology? Because, if we take math as an example, somebody whose knowledge of calculus comes from books, comes from having studied many different kinds of problems, but who otherwise wouldn't have been able to, say, invent calculus on one's own. is not as well placed to answer a challenging, new, or unfamiliar type of calculus question as somebody like, say, the young Newton or the young Leibniz. Somebody with the willingness and ability to invent calculus from scratch. They know it from first principles. They don't know it in this sort of bottom-up way. When they encounter a challenging, unfamiliar question, their chance of getting it right is greater than, somebody who just learned it in AP math or something, who would not have been able to otherwise invent it on their own. So there's a way that for you to be really sure of your conclusions as regards theology, you should have been able to just, take the Bible and whatever other sources of revelation or authority were current at the time of the early church, and just based on that information alone, you should have been able to predict Nicaea. You should have been able to predict that, assuming that the other conclusions were valid, that is, you should have been able to predict that God is in fact, three hypostases and one ousia. You should have been able to predict icon veneration, assuming that you consider that a valid practice. And you should have been able to predict that slavery would eventually sort of be dispensed with for essentially Christian reasons, despite its apparent explicit compatibility with Christian doctrine, being that it is, in the Bible. Slaves, obey your masters is even in the New Testament. And that's it's not enough to just have studied theology as a catechumen and then say, well, yes, I can see all the reasoning for Nicaea. Seeing it in retrospect is something totally different from really getting it from first principles, the real test of that would be whether you could predict it. So that's why I talk about reproducing it, being able to reproduce it as the real mark of someone who knows what they're doing theologically and whose opinions could hypothetically be trusted. And I'm trusting that in this debate, that's basically no one. I don't think anybody could have really is such a whiz kid that they, given only the starting assumptions, say, that the early church had, given only that information, they would be able to piece it out. In part because theology is revealed. It's not this impersonal subject like geometry, or science that is sort of open to everyone, and it's sort of drawn out in this impersonal and law-like way. Theology is relational, and it comes from the revelation of God. So it's a mistake to sort of believe that one can, given a sufficient amount of study, can sort of predict and independently verify everything like a scientist. So conversely, to find out how likely it is that God would have let one's ability to find the true church reliably rest on one's own ability to independently reproduce, verify, and or reinvent, where necessary, all of theology for oneself, we need to ask two questions. First, how easy or difficult is theology? Since depending on how difficult or easy theology is, the a priori motivation for the A proposition will respectively either rise or fall. And second, we can assume that God is both willing and able to providentially ensure that the papacy remains infallible in the ways that the Catholic Church claims God does. Like, if you thought that, maybe God can't actually do something like ensure that the primatial leader will always be divinely protected from binding the faithful to error, because that would represent some kind of a priori limit on human freedom, and God is a respecter of human freedom, having created it. Well, that then you might think, well, however much motivation there might be for the idea that finding the true church reliably wouldn't all reduce to a matter of one's own personal theological acumen, nonetheless, because the way Catholics are claiming we get to reliably find the true church is supposed to happen through papal infallibility, and papal infallibility would be incompatible with human freedom, or possibly incompatible with it. You might disagree with the A proposition for that reason, despite otherwise noting its sort of motivation, if that makes sense. So we have to ask the question sort of whether God is willing and able to providentially ensure that the papacy is infallible, or the primatial leader is always divinely protected from barring the faithful to error, when he speaks infallibly from the chair, let's say. So yeah, let's consider some points regarding how easy theology is, or really how hard it is. I here talk about the minimal fact set problem. What I mean by that is that, again, as I already touched on, it would be one thing if there was this set of facts that people of at least sufficiently high levels of intelligence and education could all look at and all come to the same conclusion on, as regards, what the true church is. But there doesn't appear to be such a set of facts. And to me, that what that raises is the strong possibility that when somebody is using some set of facts as a justification for their belief that, say, Presbyterianism is true, that set of facts is not really a justification. They may be right, but not for the right reason. It's like they're basically guessing, because if you can have a lot of confidence in your conclusions, but if you have a lot of confidence in your conclusions in a subject where basically any two people can look at the same set of facts and draw different conclusions without being intellectually dishonest, either of them, that should give you pause. That should actually make you not so confident. But people tend to just be super confident anyway. But and I suppose that's why, I suppose it's understandable. Like Schopenhauer said something like, every man is naturally, it's like he doesn't know what he doesn't know. It's sort of the limits are of his knowledge are sort of natural and inevitable as the horizon line is, and in our field of perception. And so but really, as a matter of fact, theology is really hard, at least where it not being hard. Theology is really hard, at least where what being hard means is that there's no set of facts that anyone can agree on, even at the highest levels of intelligence and education, seemingly, or holiness. If one thinks that somehow true theological discernment is not fueled by book learning, but by holiness. The problem is that we seem to have very holy people in all churches, at least as far as I'm concerned. Again, others might consider themselves better judges of holiness than I. I would ask, on what does that superior competence rest? Not that it's inconceivable that someone could be holier than I am, but I'm just saying that if one is making the claim that I can discern holiness better than you because I'm holier than you, it's sort of a hard claim to make. It seems to run the risk of falsifying itself. Humility being part of holiness, at least as usually conceived within Christianity. So yeah, you have somebody like Eric Ibarra in his debate with Ubi Petrus. And assuming Eric Ibarra is not intellectually dishonest in pretending not to see something that he actually does see, this man knows a tremendous amount about both Protestantism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And he's still Catholic, which means that the minimal fact set for either of those is something larger and more comprehensive than what Eric Ibarra knows. I'm not ruling out that someone could say that Presbyterianism is true on the basis of facts. But what I am skeptical of is that there's this articulated there's this articulated fact set that, everyone can agree on and come away with the same conclusion, or even one that is reasonably likely to be articulated in the near future. Really, I'm skeptical that there is an articulable fact set that everyone can agree, entails Presbyterianism, let's say. I'm not ruling out that someone can know Presbyterianism is true on the basis of facts, but if they did, I would just think they know it on the basis of more facts than they're actually spelling out. Because you can ask me, well, do you think anyone ever really knew theology? Do you think the church fathers did? And it's like, maybe, but it's like a mathematician might know something, and you ask, how do you know? And they say, well, because of these things. And it turns out that just based on that information, you can't actually construct a rigorous proof. The mathematician may know based on a rigorous proof, but he hasn't spelled everything out, right? So I'm not ruling out the possibility of one being able to know that a given non-Catholic church is true based on some set of theological facts, but I am skeptical that that set of facts has actually been spelled out for us. And I am skeptical that it really ever could be too, but I'm not ruling it out. In other words, it would be a problem if I said, I know that no one can know anything in theology, because like Hegel said, to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. How would I know that no one can know anything about theology unless on some level I had already attained the transcendent or global vantage point, outside of theology, surveying the whole of it? I can't claim that. But I'm going to be skeptical, and I think I have reason to be skeptical until, I find the sort of the black swan that punctures my skepticism. So let me see. Yeah, because again, well, not again, but I want to make something clear here, that it would be useful for me to make clear, which is sort of the epistemological assumptions of this argument. It is unrealistic to make moral certainty depend on being able to prove something beyond all conceivable doubt. After all, there is no definitive proof that what we currently experience is the real reality, rather than, for example, the hallucination of a brain in a vat. Rather, we are justified in at least provisionally assuming certain conclusions unless or until some kind of decisive evidence for a different view emerges. In this case, I have argued, that the a priori motivation for the thesis that God wouldn't let the matter of finding the true church all come down on you. I think there's enough motivation for that idea, and that he would have provided an alternative means, say, a way of being able to take this on authority, or a way of being able to find the true church that doesn't rest on personal theological acumen. I think there's enough justification for that idea that we're at least provisionally justified in assuming Catholicism based on an attitude of theological skepticism, which will sort of prevail unless/until some kind of decisive first order case for a non-Catholic church emerges, or some kind of decisive first order negative case against Catholicism emerges that decisively shows Catholicism to be incoherent, for example. Yeah, and again, I'm not closed off to the possibility of a non-Catholic church being true. I just rather see myself as justified in continuing to operate on the assumption that it's not true until it is proven true, because of this high motivation that I think exists for the idea that God would not have let finding the true church really be a matter of one's own personal theological acumen, the way it seems to have to be if papal infallibility isn't true, so that there's a burden of proof that the other side has to meet, as far as I'm concerned. So going back up, so we got some formulas here later on. I still haven't covered all the motivations for my assumption, nor all the difficulties of theology. But so yeah, let's go back to this. Another way to sort of come at the difficulty of theology and appreciate the difficulty of theology is to ask yourself, like, if you were studying some kind of novel or alien phenomenon that didn't have any analog or precedent in terms of anything that you could find on Earth, and it's like very protean and very unpredictable as far as, you know, it goes through a series of evolutions, right? Like, it's like The Thing from the movie The Thing, or it's like some strange alien life form, like from the movie Annihilation. It does very unpredictable things from one moment to the next, and now you're sort of trying to guess about its future form, what form it's going to take, or at the very least you're trying to minimize inaccuracy as regards your predictions about what future form it's going to take. The question is, given something very strange and hard to understand, even assuming that it is a determinate phenomenon, there is determinacy, there's in reality only one form it can take next, should you, for the purposes of modeling its evolution, assume there are many possibilities as regards its next stage, or only a few? If you assume there was only a few, like 2, for example, this is sort of almost like the Monty Hall problem, but I'm not going to get into that. But it's a similar principle that I'm using here. I'm going to, someone might not really be so silly as to assume there were only 2 possibilities, but we see the principle clearly if someone assumes there are only 2 possibilities for what the thing can take next, and therefore that any guess he has as to what form it will take next necessarily has a 50% chance of being right, since there are only 2 possibilities. Even if in reality there's only one possibility, because it's a determinate phenomenon, we should treat it like it's something that could basically is capable of anything, right? We should assume there are many possibilities in this possibility space, or treat this possibility space as one that encompasses many, many, many different possibilities, if only as a matter of, even if that's not going to make us right about what it's going to be next, it's going to at least prevent us from committing the false positive error of saying, well, there's only two possibilities, and this possibility therefore has a 50% chance of being right, therefore I guess this possibility, and I turn out to be wrong, like way more than 50% of the time. So the point being, the more kind of novel and strange a phenomenon is, the more we should treat it as something that encompasses a wide variety of possibilities. And I'm going to argue that theology is like a novel or alien phenomenon. even in a sense, even more than a life form like the Thing or from the movie Annihilation, because theology, in large measure at least, as far as I can tell, or I mean, ultimately, it's always going to flow from the nature of God, which is unlike anything earthly, even anything extraterrestrial, anything in the universe, right? And there's no gaming God or figuring him out. You're very much at his mercy as far as his self-disclosure. And, that's why I think that there's a lot of, I know some people are allergic to the term doctrinal development, but substitute any word you prefer. There is apparent change that's not really change, but it looks like change, and we need a word for it, right? And I'm going to use development. There's a lot of development, not only in the Old Testament, but in between the Old and the New Testament, and not only in the Bible, but between, the end of the biblical period and the early church, or between the church that Jesus founded and the church of Nicaea and or the church of 1000 AD. There's always this development. I think if you take the standard of the really appropriate standard for being able to say that that what you're talking about, the really appropriate standard for that is being able to predict it in advance. I think basically no one would have succeeded in predicting a lot of these developments. Slavery, we already talked about that. Polygamy, in the Old Testament, be fruitful and multiply, and there's seemingly no restrictions on how many wives you can have. In the New Testament, now suddenly, if anything, celibacy is valorized. Celibacy is the thing to be. I wish all could be such as I am, right? Paul says. We had this whole Mosaic covenant that was supposedly forever. Mind you, see, I think the ancients, the way they use forever, it means unto the age. So it doesn't really mean what we think of when we think of forever. It means something sort of more, something more like just indefinitely, which I know a lot of people wouldn't necessarily agree with me. And a lot of people think that See, we moderns say things like for all eternity, and we think we mean something by that. The more I think about a phrase like for all eternity, the more I am at a total loss to even say what that means. I think in a certain sense, the ancients were wiser to have this strangely bounded sort of conception of eternity unto the age. It's up to the horizon line. What's beyond the horizon, you don't even really know. There's a certain sense in which it may not yet possess definite existence, but that's sort of beside the point. The Mosaic law is forever until it's not, right? And suddenly Jesus is saying, well, the divorce law is like the law of God, from which not even a jot or tittle will pass away, and yet he only gave you that because your hearts were hard. There's tooth for tooth, eye for eye, and there's turn the other cheek. And just who would have quite been able to predict that? I'm not sure. If we give someone who is very confident in his ability to figure theology out, who hypothetically hasn't studied much theology yet, a time machine and send him back in time, is he really going to predict all the things that do happen, right? No. There seems to be significant development of doctrine as regards Satan. He seems to be more like God's deputy early on, and then later on he's God's adversary, or at least thinks himself to be God's adversary. Maybe God doesn't have adversaries as far as God is concerned. yeah, I mean, like in the Old Testament, there doesn't really appear to be an afterlife until there's this sort of a rumor or a whisper of a resurrection. But even then, it doesn't look like you're conscious in the interim between your death and that resurrection. And then Paul is saying, you know, to live is Christ, to die is gain. I think there's like the notion that if he dies, he's going to be with Christ immediately. That's why it's gain. I mean, possibly he's thinking of, I don't know, like when you're anesthetized, you're not conscious during the interval where you're anesthetized. So he's thinking that he's going to wake right up, you know, as at the resurrection, however long a period there is between his death and the resurrection. But I'm skeptical of that for two reasons. One, Sheol and Hades never quite seem to be unconsciousness in terms of the way they are understood, you know, by Hebrew and Greek culture respectively. It's always a place of sort of maybe half consciousness or shadowy half existence. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man is conscious when he goes down into that place, and sort of all the Greek heroes are too, like when they descend into the underworld, but they just really miss being alive because they don't have much going on in the underworld. Because who can conceive of non-existence? It's like neither X nor not X. It's neither light nor darkness, neither light nor not light, something like that. And well, the other thing is too, you know, the theology explicitly develops, at least in the ancient churches, maybe not like Jehovah's Witnesses or certain fringe Protestant groups, but the theology explicitly develops that as soon as you die, you are with Christ consciously, and not just waiting until the resurrection, or rather, it's not that you're only with him after the resurrection. Okay, so yeah, again, so we go from resurrection to like instant heaven, and then of course monotheism, simple monotheism, to Trinitarian monotheism. I think that was the real curveball. I'm not saying it's wrong. I know that it can be explained in hindsight. I know there are many ways of holding theology together, but I'm just saying that one should be realistic about whether one could have really predicted these things in advance, given how many possibilities we should assume there are for modeling purposes, at least. The Sabbath day changes. There seems to be development regarding the timeline of the second coming, because that seems to be imminent in the early church, and then later on it's sort of understood to be perhaps more spiritualized, but at the very least it's way off in the offing, or potentially way off in the future. We go from these simple gatherings and home churches to elaborate liturgies and, you know, big churches, and I think that this illustrates that the ways in which theology can validly evolve are surprised by anyone's account, because you might not think it's right to not have home churches anymore, but I'm saying some of these you're going to consider valid developments, and I think this illustrates that the ways in which theology can validly evolve are surprising and counterintuitive, to say the least, which in practical terms means we should assume that there are many degrees of freedom in the space of possible ways of holding all of theology together, and also of holding all of Catholicism together. So this is why when people make negative cases against Catholicism, yes, there's a certain way in which those work better for disproving Catholicism than a positive case for a different church, which is mutually exclusive with Catholicism. Because Catholicism false is a simpler hypothesis than Presbyterianism is true, therefore Catholicism false. I get that. But if someone makes a negative case against Catholicism, usually it's reflecting these very particular understandings of how the magisterium does work or can work. It can only be understood in this self-contradictory way. We can only take a certain interpretation of this Pope's words, and wouldn't you know it, it just leads to Catholicism being false. And the Catholic apologists will say, well, what if that's not the only way it works? What if it could work like this, it could work like that, and then that's dismissed as cope? But I'm saying really, where there are many options, or where we should assume, where we have grounds for assuming there are many options, the more specific you make your stance as to how the magisterium can and should work, how different people's statements should be interpreted, the greater is your chance of being wrong, simply. Like, so I those negative cases for me would need a high level of motivation for their assumptions, higher than the motivation that exists, say, for the idea that God wouldn't have let finding the true church reliably all rest on your own ability to investigate every single theological issue for yourself. That's sort of what it would take to convince me even of the falsity of Catholicism using a purely negative case, given how many degrees of freedom we should assume there are in theology based on its sort of, let's say, unpredictable nature. Because, again, this highlights the importance of not leaning on your own understanding, and goodness knows it works in the other direction as well. The thing I've really found most difficult to understand about Orthodox apologetics, especially so-called ortho-bro apologetics, is these people are so confident in their theological conclusions, and they act like you're an alien if you don't just understand the intuitive, automatic force of whatever argument they're making. And, I feel almost like I'm on a different planet than they are, because I'll see the same premises and I just don't know how the conclusion necessarily follows. Because, I'm assuming there are many possibilities, and they seem to be assuming there are only a few, which entitles them to, very great certainty as regards, the sort of theology that can establish that their church is the true church and that everyone else is visibly, obviously in error on issues X, Y, and Z. Again, I can understand why they would have to assume theology is so perspicuous, because otherwise there's no reliable way of finding the true church. But I just am open to the possibility that it's really not perspicuous, and in fact I feel led to that conclusion just based on the real facts that we find of arbitrarily smart and knowledgeable people being on all points of the ecclesial map as a matter of empirical fact. This highlights the importance of not leaning on your own understanding in theology, because of the way in which even valid development can because the ways in which even valid development can occur look practically indistinguishable from a straightforward contradiction, at least by our dim lights. And goodness knows the Bible just by itself is full of apparent contradictions, sometimes from one verse to the next. But that doesn't give me any trouble, because, again, I'm not assuming theology is a simple phenomenon that we model with just a few possibilities in the possibility space, right? I'm not assuming, like the 13-year-old atheist, that there's only a few ways of holding all of biblical teaching together. I'm assuming there are many. And to the extent that someone is committing to a very definite interpretation for really hard to understand reasons, they're increasing their chance of being wrong. Let me see. I think I might have covered these points. Yeah. And again, I'm not resting my case for Catholicism on a first order case. I'm not saying it's true because the filioque is obviously true, you dummies. I'm not doing that. And I think any such approach is just so problematic. But it's unfortunately for every like non-Catholic church, the approach that every non-Catholic church basically is forced to take. Yes, I'm not resting my case for Catholicism on some kind of positive first order case, but really rather on the very imperspicuity of theology itself. So, third point, if non-Catholicism is true, it makes theological correctness the sort of de facto fifth mark of the church, requiring the believer to identify the true church by determining which church has the most correct theology. Whatever your understanding of correct theology is. This, if you pay attention, this effectively imposes on the believer not only the obligation to decide what correct theology is, but by implication, crucially, what the correct criterion is in light of which to determine what true theology is and what it's not. But to be able to determine what true theology is and is not in a principled fashion, you would seemingly need to have some kind of meta criterion ready to hand, in light of which to make a judgment about what criterion is right to use, and a meta criterion for your meta criterion, and so on ad infinitum. Yet, if an infinite regress is as impossible as most theistic arguments assume, that's usually why, God is assumed to exist as a sort of first cause. An infinite regress never seems to quite get to the first cause. You can take those arguments for what they're worth. But assuming that an infinite regress is invalid, then some principle of no Tower of Turtles is valid, and yet non-Catholicism obligates you to find the true church by finding which church has the correct theology. But to do that, you have to posit a criterion of theological correctness and a criterion for the criterion. And unless you are capable of following the infinite regress all the way to the last number of an infinite series, let's say, you're going to just have to terminate your criterion at some more or less unprincipled point. You're going to have to rest your assumption on nothing. And that's really just another way of seeing why theology always seems to be so squishy, or like one could derive any position from the available data and or none of the positions from the available data. So this sort of criterial regress argument shows that a non-Catholicism, even your most intensively reasoned theology, ends up being somewhat unprincipled and random, analogous to a shot in the dark or a blindfolded swing at a piñata. Now you might say that's just not fair because everyone makes assumptions. I have said that to the extent that an infinite regress is invalid, then the assumption that there should not be an infinite regress is a valid one. And then elsewhere, I'm resting my case on the improbability of God ever letting the matter of determining which church is the true church rest entirely on the shoulders of the individual and their own capacity to be right about every conceivable, in the limit, theological issue. And I think that's a pretty strongly motivated assumption. It's not arbitrary. But I feel like when it comes to non-Catholic cases, the assumptions are often all too arbitrary. If there is time, I would like to address Dr. Sijuwade's paper on the identity of the true church, arguing that the true church is the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's using criteria that are adapted from Richard Swinburne, who in turn seems to have been borrowing from the work of Derek Parfit, Reasons in Persons, the persistence conditions of persons, under what conditions is a person the same person that they were before. Dr. Sijuwade argues that using Swinburne's criteria of organizational of connectedness or continuity at the level of organization and at the level of aims, we can see that the Eastern Orthodox Church has the most continuity as an institution with the Church of the Council of Nicaea that gave us the four marks of the Church, that it should be one, holy, apostolic, and one holy, apostolic, and Catholic. That would have been ironic if I forgot that one. The issue with that is I would agree that there are certain ways that the Eastern Orthodox Church does resemble the early church, even most closely resembles the early church. But I think there are other ways where it doesn't. So if you take continuity of organization as a criterion, seems like the church of the first millennium could meet efficiently and rule on issues efficiently. But the church of the second millennium, if the true church is the Eastern Orthodox Church, seemingly loses the ability to do that. It can only hold councils once in a blue moon. They tend to be limited in scope and size, and they're just sort of received ecumenically over a long time period thereafter, rather than actually being ecumenical in terms of convocation and scope. Florence looked like an ecumenical council. It was a lot more ecumenical than the council that vindicated Gregory Palamas as against Barlaam. Yet it was a false council per the Eastern Orthodox. And, we got a taste of sort of how efficient and flexible and limber the Eastern Orthodox Church is at an organizational level, with the Council of Crete. And that just doesn't appear to have been the church in the first millennium. You can debate over why, but I'm just saying, in that sense, the Catholic Church looks like the more plausible successor. And so the question of which church more resembles the early church has a certain intrinsic arbitrariness to it. Who more resembles Dr. Sijuwade? Is it I because I am a man, like he is, or is it a woman who is of African descent because she is of the same background as he is? Who is it? Well, you can't really answer that question. The answer to that question will force you to make certain assumptions about what resembling means, what resemblance is, and those assumptions are always going to be somewhat arbitrary. Let me see.